World War I effects. World War I is one of the deadliest conflicts in history, with an estimated 9 million combatants and 7 million civilian deaths as a direct result of the war. World War I, often abbreviated as World War I or World War I, also known as the First World War, the Great War, the Seminole Catastrophe, and initially in North America as the European War, was a global war originating in Europe that lasted from July 28, 1914 to November 11, 1918. Contemporaneously described as the war to end all wars, it led to the mobilization of more than 70 million military personnel, including 60 million Europeans, making it one of the largest wars in history. It is also one of the deadliest conflicts in history, with an estimated 9 million combatants and 7 million civilian deaths as a direct result of the war, while resulting genocides and the resulting 1918 influenza pandemic caused another 50 to 100 million deaths worldwide. The term First World War was first used in September 1914 by German biologist and philosopher Ernst Haeckel, who claimed that there is no doubt that the course and character of the feared European Wehr will become the First World War in the full sense of the word, citing a wire service report in the Indianapolis Star on September 20, 1914. Prior to World War II, the events of 1914 to 1918 were generally known as the Great War or simply the World War. In October 1914, the Canadian magazine Maclean's wrote, "Some wars name themselves. This is the Great War." Contemporary Europeans also referred to it as the War to End War or the War to End All Wars due to their perception of its then unparalleled scale and devastation. After World War II began in 1939, the terms became more standard, with British Empire historians, including Canadians, favoring the First World War and Americans World War I. Zimmerman telegram. Most historians agree that American involvement in World War I was inevitable by early 1917, but the march to war was accelerated by a letter penned by German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmerman. On January 16, 1917, British code breakers intercepted an encrypted message from Zimmerman intended for Heinrich von Eckert, the German ambassador to Mexico. The missive gave the ambassador a now famous set of instructions: if the neutral United States entered the war on the side of the Allies, von Eckert was to approach Mexico's president with an offer to forge a secret wartime alliance. The Germans would provide military and financial support for a Mexican attack on the United States, and in exchange Mexico would be free to annex lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. In addition, von Eckert was told to use the Mexicans as a go-between to entice the Japanese Empire to join the German cause. The British cryptographic office known as Room 40 decoded the Zimmerman telegram and handed it over to the United States in late February 1917. By March 1, its scandalous contents were splashed on the front pages of newspapers nationwide. Diplomatic relations between Germany and the United States had already been severed in early February, when Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare and began preying on U.S. vessels in the Atlantic. While many Americans remained committed to isolationism, President Woodrow Wilson had only just won re-election using the slogan, "He kept us out of war." The Zimmerman cipher now served as fresh evidence of German aggression. Coupled with the submarine attacks, it finally turned the U.S. government in favor of entering the fray. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson abandoned his policy of neutrality and asked Congress to declare war against Germany and the Central Powers. The United States would cast its lot with the Allies 4 days later. Liberty sandwiches. During World War I, the U.S. government tried to rename hamburgers as Liberty sandwiches to promote patriotism. In World War I, Germany was considered the main culprit and provocateur of the war. Therefore, it stirred the movement against Germans in the United States. Prior to the war, German Americans were able to express and promote their ethnic culture through the fine arts and language. Once the war began, German Americans came under public scrutiny and ostracism. To raise support for the war, German culture was belittled to establish the notion of superiority of America. Any traces of German culture was erased in America. For example, instead of saying hamburger, which has German roots, it was called Liberty Sandwich. I thought Foner did a good job in presenting the anti-German crusade. He stated several statistics to demonstrate how the war negatively affected German Americans and their culture. However, Foner could have developed and expanded the topic more to illustrate the hardships of German Americans during the war. The three images above adds depth to the portrayal of how German Americans were singled out and excluded from mainstream America. The Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan, devised a decade before the start of World War I, outlined a strategy for Germany to avoid fighting at its eastern and western fronts simultaneously. The Schlieffen Plan, devised a decade before the start of World War I, outlined a strategy for Germany to avoid fighting at its eastern and western fronts simultaneously. But what had been meticulously designed to deal a swift right hook attack on France and then advance on Russia, dragged on to become an ugly, brutal war of attrition. The Schlieffen Plan didn't work because it was based on everything going right and it had no contingencies for the fog of war, said Peter Fritsch, professor of history at the University of Illinois. The Schlieffen Plan got its name from its creator, Count Alfred von Schlieffen, who served as chief of the Imperial German General Staff from 1891 to 1906. Count Schlieffen drew up the operation between 1897 and 1905 after an alliance established between Russia and France in 1891 meant that Germany could face a two-front war. Schlieffen's strategy assumed that Russia, having recently lost the Russo-Japanese War, would take at least 6 weeks to mobilize its troops and attack Germany from the east. In that time, Germany would stage an attack on France by marching west through neutral territory of the Netherlands and Belgium. This route avoided the heavily fortified direct border with France. Then German forces would swoop south, delivering a hammer blow through Flanders, Belgium and onward into Paris, enveloping and crushing French forces in less than 45 days. Once France was defeated, according to the plan, Germany could transport its soldiers east using its railroad network and deploy them against the Russian troops, which Schlieffen believed would require 6 weeks to mobilize and attack Germany's eastern border. Schlieffen's plan was adopted by Helmuth von Moltke, chief of the German General Staff when war broke out in 1914. Moltke made some critical modifications to the plan, including reducing German forces making up the right hook attack into France and invading through Belgium, but not the Netherlands, during the initial offensive. The problem, says Professor Fritsch, is the Schlieffen blueprint proved inflexible. First, Belgium refused Germany free passage and fought the incoming German soldiers. The English army got involved immediately. Moreover, the violation of Belgium's neutral territory drew England into the war since they had promised to defend Belgium under the Treaty of London of 1839. After facing fierce resistance in Belgium and with soldiers from the British Empire in the fight alongside France, Germany's planned swift offensive was slowed. Unchanged room for a century. Hubert Rochereau, died in World War I, is a French officer whose room is preserved with his belongings since 1918, his death in Belgium. The name of Dragoons officer Hubert Rochereau is commemorated on a war memorial in Belabre, his native village in central France, along with those of other young men who lost their lives in the First World War. But Rochereau also has a much more poignant and exceptional memorial. His room in a large family house in the village has been preserved with his belongings for almost 100 years since his death in Belgium. A lace bedspread is still on the bed, adorned with photographs and Rochereau's feathered helmet. His moth-eaten military jacket hangs limply on a hanger. His chair, tucked under his desk, faces the window in the room where he was born on October 10, 1896. He died in an English field ambulance on April 26, 1918, a day after being wounded during fighting for control of the village of Locher, in Belgium. The village was in Allied hands for much of the war but changed hands several times between 25 and 30 April, and was finally recaptured by French forces 4 days after Rochereau's death. The parents of the young officer kept his room exactly as it was the day he left for the battlefront. When they decided to move in 1935, they stipulated in the sale that Rochereau's room should not be changed for 500 years. This clause had no legal basis, said the current owner, retired local official Daniel Fabre, who showed the room to the Nouvelle République newspaper. But nevertheless he and his wife, who inherited the house from her grandparents, have respected the wishes of Rochereau's parents and will continue to do so.